Yes, I want to take a view of what Leicester was looking like in the post-war decades. Now, we heard before the tea break that there's at least one other city that is hoping to find a king and looking forward to perhaps some luck on the front of the football. And I'm sure it's not the only place that in recent years has seen the coverage of the discovery of Richard III and the success of the football club, and would consider Leicester to be a lucky place. Well, actually, as early as 1946, the Daily Mail described Leicester as, and I quote, probably the most consistently lucky town in Europe, with negligible levels of unemployment. Leicester factories were working full-time to meet orders. In the 2 decades following the end of the Second World War, newspaper coverage presented a prosperous city with good employment levels, increasing land values, and a city growing and developing to meet the needs of modern living. Leicester escaped the Second World War without the significant bomb damage of other cities, and it suffered comparatively little loss of life. So with minimal damage to industrial buildings, it was a shortage of labour and materials that resulted in the inability of companies to fulfil all their orders. That Daily Mail journalist who walked through Leicester in 1946 described sensing the spirit of a town that is quietly doing well. Perhaps not so surprising so soon after the end of the war, you might say. However, some 20 years later, in April 1966, the Financial Times carried an article entitled "City of Leicester, Prosperity Maintains a Long Tradition." And when Konrad Smigelski wrote Leicester Today and Tomorrow in 1969, he recognised the city as being one of the most prosperous cities in England. And it was against this backdrop of prosperity that the post-war planning of Leicester was undertaken and the image of the city was promoted. The city's Publicity and Development Committee produced a variety of materials to attract business investment to the city and to promote the city as a conference venue and to illustrate to visitors and residents alike what Leicester actually had to offer. Now, this material received national recognition and it was widely distributed, presenting an image of the city to readers throughout the country and actually around the world. Using publicity material produced by the local authority, what I'd like to do in this talk is consider how Leicester portrayed itself and the sites that were being used to promote the city during the post-war decades. And looking in particular at 2 leaflets, A Day in Leicester and Leicester City of History and Progress. Both were available in the 1930s and revised and reprinted for over 40 years. And they'll show how the image has changed over time in order to promote both the history and the progress of Leicester. The Leicestershire Regional Planning Report of 1932 focused strongly on Leicestershire, with the city itself viewed very much as the county market town for agricultural produce, minerals and textile manufactures, which are made here and come hither from the county generally. The document's recognition of the historic aspects of the city extend as far as a couple of pages within the historical survey of the county and its development, and the inclusion of the protected features within the city that were recorded on the list of protected ancient monuments in the county of Leicester. Both the Official Industrial Handbook of 1947, which is up there, and the Leicester Official Handbook of 1956 described an industrial town reverberating with the rhythm of its machinery. However, alongside this music of manufacture, the 1956 Official Handbook referred to a huge shopping centre at the heart of the town, with window displays that almost tug at your sleeve in their demand for attention. So it was 1933 when the Publicity and Development Committee was first established to publish information concerning the city, its industries and amenities. And this range of publications promoted the city to a variety of audiences. They highlighted points of interest which were considered worth promoting and demonstrated what the local authority considered to be important parts of Leicester's story at the time. The Corporation of Leicester recognised the need to promote more aspects of the city than just that role as a market town. In 1945, the government asked the Travel and Industrial Development Association to begin immediately to plan for the development of the tourist traffic to the British Isles as soon as this is again possible. Now, Leicester was swift to respond to this, and the meeting of the Publicity and Development Committee on the 13th of November 1945 authorised the bringing up to date of the department's literature. W.G. Hoskins' The Heritage of Leicester, which is coming in a moment, there we go, The Heritage of Leicestershire, was published in 1946. This was the first of a number of post-war publications commissioned by the committee, which drew upon the skills and knowledge of academics from University College Leicester. Hoskins was reader in English local history at the University College. The publication, which focused on the material heritage of the county, was illustrated with 52 photographs supplied by Mr. F.L. Attenborough, principal of University College at the time. With the growth in car ownership in the interwar period, Leicester's Publicity and Development Committee recognised the need to produce a guide for the motorist. Touring Leicestershire was published on the 26th of April 1948, was also written by Hoskins and illustrated by Attenborough's photographs. It contained a collection of 8 tours, each of which started in Leicester and directed the motorcar driver to places of interest around the county. It was actually a very popular publication, with sales averaging about 80 a day when it was first published. Also published in 1948 was History in Leicester, a historical guide to the city written by Colin Ellis. The book provided a comprehensive history of the city by historical periods, each of which was evidenced by photographs of what still remained of each period. It also contained a map, which you can see up there, which illustrated where architectural evidence of the city's history could be seen in the city centre. And this was another publication where the city's higher education establishments were contributing to the development of materials promoting Leicester. The layout and general production of this book was undertaken by staff from the city's College of Art, which is now part of De Montfort University. In 1951, a guide to the city was produced. This was written by Professor Jack Simmons, a historian from the University College, and again illustrated by photographs by Attenborough. In contrast to touring Leicestershire, the Simmons Guide to Leicester was designed for the pedestrian, encouraging them to walk around the city and gaze at what it had to offer. Again, this was another well-received publication. A particularly favourable review was in the Nottingham Guardian, which recognised the success with which Leicester promoted itself by describing our sister city Leicester, always well to the fore in matters of publicity and information about herself. In 1939, the leaflets City of History and Progress and A Day in Leicester were part of a group of publications described by the Advertisers Weekly as taking the palm for municipal publicity. Wartime regulations banned new publications, so materials didn't alter during the war, and these 2 items continued to be revised and reprinted for over 40 years. and as I said, provide good examples to illustrate how the city was viewed and presented over those decades. A 1930s edition of A Day in Leicester provided a map and an itinerary with some information on the principal points of interest highlighted. The only images were on the front cover, 2 images dating back to Leicester's Roman, Saxon and Norman heritage, both of which were detailed on the inside pages, and an image of the 19th century town hall, along with an image of the city coat of arms, which were a clear statement of civic involvement in the publication. It wasn't revised until 1954. It retained the revised format then until the 1960s. The format of a map and itinerary with some information on each of the places of interest remained, with the addition of some general information such as hotels, cafes and banks, which would be of interest to visitors from outside the city. But by the 1950s, the front cover carried 10 photographic images of places of interest in the city, but the city's coat of arms still remained prominent in the centre. The images used on the cover in the 1950s provided a greater pictorial introduction to the city. The town hall still featured in the top right, and St Nicholas Church had now moved bottom left to the corner. But the image gave a wider view of the area, showing the church in the relation to the Roman Jewry wall, which occupied the foreground of the image. The Guildhall, parts of which date from the 14th century, and the City Museum, built in 1837, now both appeared on the cover. And the municipal life of the city was also represented in the image of de Montfort Hall, the municipal entertainment venue built in 1913. And adjacent to that image is the War Memorial, designed by Edwin Lutyens, and another addition to the city from the first quarter of the 20th century. The images on the row above show the green space of the city's Abbey Park, a view of the gardens, the river, and the remains of Cavendish House located in the park. The bottom right corner contained an image of Skeffington House, dating from the 16th and 17th centuries. Both the corporation and businesses of Leicester recognised the contribution of the city's past in promoting the place and the products that it produced. Local businesses used images of historic sites not just to promote their goods to markets away from the city, but also part of their branding, or to inform employees in the city about the city in which they worked. In 1950, the Forum Cafe on High Cross Street was granted permission to use the local authorities' negatives in order to reproduce images of the Roman Forum and St Nicholas Church and the Roman Forum and Jewry Wall on their menus for their cafe. In the late 1950s, Cora's, a large local employer in the textile industry, ran a series of features in their in-house magazine entitled Know Your Leicester. In order to illustrate these features, they requested permission to reproduce images of historic buildings, such as the Clock Tower, the Guildhall, and de Montfort Hall. By 1952, the City of Leicester Development Plan identified Leicester primarily as an industrial town, whilst recognising the continuation of its function as a county town. The document also recognised the national and international trade conducted within the city. And this was reflected by requests from businesses to use images of the city to promote Leicester products abroad. For example, in 1951, a boot manufacturer purchased 28 images of the city for display in shops in Texas and on Fifth Avenue, New York. And in 1958, Messrs G. Stibbe & Co., a local producer of knitting machinery, used large images of the Clock Tower, the Guildhall, Abbey Park, de Montfort Hall, Leicester University, the city and the City Police Headquarters on their stand at the Hanover International Trade Fair. Now, with Leicester becoming a university city in 1957, the inclusion of the image of Leicester University would have clearly reflected the city's new status at the time. Even organisations bringing conference business to Leicester were also selecting historical images of the city in their promotion materials. The British Pharmaceutical Students Association chose images of the Guildhall and the Roman Forum site to illustrate their article in Future Pharmacist in advance of their conference here in 1955. And Messrs Glaxo used a print of the clock tower for the brochure for their conference in the city in May 1960. I think the range of publications that have used images is also quite interesting. They are as diverse as the Midland Bank Chronicle, Knitwear and Stockings, and the Rubber Journal International Plastics, all of which used images of historic aspects of Leicester, like the Guildhall, Clock Tower, and Town Hall Square, in their publications. During the 1950s, the last of wartime rationing came to an end, and a level of normality returned to the city. Leicester celebrated the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, and the Education Committee presented 1,500 copies of the Colin Ellis book, History in Leicester, to the senior scholars in city schools as a souvenir of the coronation. The Lord Mayor presented a copy to Princess Margaret when she visited Leicester in 1955. And in 1956, 40 copies of the Symonds Guide to Leicester were supplied to the Lord Mayor for presentation to the England versus Wales boys football match held in Leicester. No, I don't know the score, I'm sorry. Now, although concerns were raised about unemployment at both the start and the end of the decade, Leicester continued to flourish during the 1950s. By the end of the decade, the city even had a drive-in bank. And at the start of August 1961, nearly £1 million was paid to Leicester workers in holiday bonus pay as the city's annual fortnight's holiday period began. Now, that was 1961. At today's prices, that would be £20 million. Well, in excess of, actually. And property prices were also high, with a record auction price equivalent to £2.5 million per acre paid for the premises of G. Folwell and Sons in the marketplace in June 1961. And in November that year, Jackson the Tailors paid the equivalent of £5,324,000 per acre for a shop in Gallowtree Gate. That'd be over £100 million today. Existing stores in the city also announced expansion plans. The Co-op planning to open the largest food hall in the Midlands as part of its £1 million development in High Street. And Lewis's announced the purchase of land and buildings occupied by Hamshaw's garage and showrooms in order to facilitate the expansion of their Humberston Gate department store. By December 1961, Rediffusion's wired sound and television service had opened in the city, with plans to erect 8,000 yards of network covering 60,000 houses by the end of 1963. And Leicester had become home to Britain's first drive-in shopping centre, based on the American model. Built over 10 months at a cost of £750,000, 15 million today, Lee Circle provided 1,050 parking spaces over 5 floors, with lifts connecting directly to the Tesco supermarket and discount store on the ground floor. It also housed a bowling alley, hairdressers, cafe, and a car laundry. By 1963, the A Day in Leicester leaflet was revised to reflect the changing city. The cover was updated with the coat of arms removed, and the images in the second and third row were altered. The ruins of Cavendish House replaced by an image of the modern Charles Street, developed in the 1930s, and particularly featuring the municipal offices of City Hall. The image of the museum was replaced by the modern multi-deck car park, spiralling gently upward towering over existing buildings like a gigantic concrete layer cake, as the Sunday Times described Lee Circle in 1961. The Abbey Park gardens were replaced by a different image of the river in Abbey Park, and the image of the river used in the 50s was replaced by an image of the Victorian clock tower, which reflected both its value to and its place as the hub of the city. Reflecting on his time in Leicester in the early 1960s, broadcaster Ray Gosling recalled the local pride for Lee Circle. They're very proud of that multi-storey car park. It features on the rack of postcard views. He felt that everything was up to date in Leicester City. Not old-fashioned, but a fully fashioned city. He went on to say that if he had to show an American in one day what England was all about, he would take them to Leicester. It has all of old England, our heritage, well kept and cared for, but without the oldie charm of a Canterbury. The Publicity and Development Committee's leaflet, Leicester City of History and Progress, consistently tried to reflect both the old and new aspects of the city. It was available in the early 1930s and revised in 1939. This revised edition received commendations in local newspapers and in the trade press. It carried an historic image on both the back and front covers. One side showed the town hall, the other the Guildhall courtyard. Inside was a map with brief information about the city and county, supported by images. The internal images showed Jury Wall, St Mary de Castro, viewed through the Tudor gateway, and images of Kirby Muxloe Castle and the ruins at Bradgate Park, in order to reflect the county. In 1955, a new design for the leaflet was approved, which replaced photographic images on the cover with drawn images representative of history and progress of the city. Inside were two maps and a much wider selection of photographic images of places of interest. The clock tower featured prominently on the front cover. Behind this were drawn representations of Leicester's Georgian buildings and its factory buildings, behind which towered the church spires of St Martin's Cathedral and St Mary de Castro Church. Further up, the images represented the civic city, with a drawing of de Montfort Hall, all of which was placed upon a silhouette of the town hall clock tower. At the very top, there's recognition of the city's Roman heritage. Opening the first fold of the leaflet revealed 24 images of the city, which were a collection of historic places of interest and more modern municipal buildings, police station, and the police station here on Charles Street, the Southfields Library, and the working marketplace. And education institutions whose expertise had been contributing to the production of materials promoting the city were now represented on the city publicity, with images of University College and the College of Art and Technology. Although there were minor changes to the design of the leaflet throughout the 50s and 60s, it wasn't until 1969 when the next significant change took place. By this point, Konrad Smigelski had been in post for 7 years, and his influence was showing. In the 1969 edition of Leicester City of History and Progress, the historic city was shown alongside the modern monorail proposed for the city in Smigelski's 1964 traffic plan. The cover carried black and white drawings of the Guildhall and the proposed monorail, with an old typeface for the historical image at the top, and the modern typeface for the image of progress. Now, whilst the content altered little, 24 internal images were reduced to 18. One historic and one modern image were made larger. The modern picture of Charles Street shows the 11-storey Epic House office block, which had a Safeway supermarket at the bottom. After 13 months of construction, at a cost of £350,000, in excess of £6 million today, Epic House opened in 1964 and became Leicester's tallest building. By the 1970s, the balance of images used had shifted more to reflect a city of progress than a city of history. Photographic images had replaced the drawings, and the clock tower had returned to the front cover. But inside, there were now only 8 images, and the 2 largest reflected the modern city. You have the Charles Wilson building on the university campus, and the modern high-rise office blocks erected in the city centre. But the efforts to show the progress of Leicester were reflected by the fact that by the 1970s, the size of the image of Epic House had reduced, and the large image of modern Leicester now showed the 17 stories high Burley's Way office block, which became the tallest commercial building in the city when it was completed in 1969. By the 1972 edition, the modern high-rise Attenborough Tower on the university campus became the wraparound image of the front and back cover. Inside were just 2 images: the Roman Jewry Wall, shown alongside the modern M1. The building of the M1 was important to Leicester, not just for the transportation of goods and materials to and from the city, but also in terms of attracting business to relocate here and occupy all these new office blocks. In 1968, the Sunday Times reported that the building of the M1 had made Leicester so attractive to London firms that one Leicester agent spent a day a week in London collecting groups of firms willing to establish offices in Leicester. Now, Smigelski's plans for a monorail never came to fruition, but in 1974, reflecting on his time in the city, Smigelski considered the Haymarket Centre to be one of his achievements whilst in post. And like the 1970 edition of Leicester City in History and Progress, when A Day in Leicester's cover was revised in 1972, it placed that same image of the clock tower in a very prominent position. The cover contained just 2 images. At the top, the old Guildhall, which depicted the city of history, and below an image of the clock tower. However, this Victorian structure and city landmark was shown with the newly developed Haymarket Centre in the background, a very modern development containing shops, restaurants and a theatre, which Smigelski felt was located where it belongs, right in the heart of the city, among all the lights. As historian Elaine Harwood notes, the changing nature of cities which were losing residential and factory buildings, as well as theatres and churches from their centres, prompted post-war planners to produce layouts which emphasised shops and offices with an entertainment quarter, and limited dwellings to a few high-quality flats aimed at professionals. With 1970s Leicester promoting the latest, tallest office block and places to eat, shop and be entertained within the city, this emphasis was certainly reflected in the images chosen to promote Leicester in the post-war decades. Using the local authority publications A Day in Leicester and Leicester City of History and Progress, I've illustrated that Leicester's use of history and heritage to promote the city has not just arisen with the discovery of Richard III. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, images of the city's historic sites dating from the Roman period were used to promote the city and demonstrate its uninterrupted history. In a city with the motto, always the same, that continuity of development was important. It was the 1950s before images of the 20th century began to be used in the city's promotion. Although more recent images, these still depicted the municipal life of the city. Whilst the city was still demonstrating the continuity of its historic past and former glories, by the 1960s, the images chosen to represent the city reflected the changes taking place and the necessary coexistence of old and new as the city adapted to the pressures of modern living. Slowly, through the late 60s and into the 1970s, there was a shift in focus as images celebrating Leicester's progress as a modern city were given more prominence than those reflecting the history of this lucky town. Thank you.